I'm gonna go ahead and take the circumference of my head, and it's great that my hair is out like this because then I know that it's gonna fit. It looks like it's 24.5. 24.5 divided by 6.8 equals 3.6.
So I took a sheet of paper and I folded it in half twice, once vertical and then once horizontal. Then the next thing I did was I just drew a curved line. That's the diameter of my head, which is 3.6 inches. So starting at that corner point, I just measured and marked 3.6 inches. And then I just continued to pivot my ruler. And each pivot that I made, I marked off that 3.6 inch mark. And then I just connected all of those points to create my curved line. And then I labeled this part bucket hat top. So later on when you hear me say the top pattern, this is the piece that I'm talking about. So when I unfolded the paper, it looks something like that.
So the next thing is to create a rectangle for the body of the hat.
Okay, so now I measured half the distance around the top pattern, and that for me was 11.5 inches. Okay, then I made a rectangle with a length of 3 inches, and then the width of the rectangle is half of my circle's circumference. And after that, I cut out the rectangle, and then I took the rectangle and I folded it in half 2 times. And then after I folded it in half and I opened it, you can see I have 3 lines of creases, and I just placed a mark at the top of each of those 3 lines. That's optional, but I just figured it would help me with cutting up those lines, but not cutting all the way through the line. So now that I have my rectangle separated like this, I'm just going to tape down one of the squares, and then now I'm going to separate each of those pieces by a ½ inch. And I just measured a ½ inch and marked it each time, and then I just taped down the squares in place. And this here is the slash and spread method that helps us to get a expanded pattern. After that, I traced all around the new pattern, and then I labeled my pattern. And this pattern here is basically the body of the hat. So later on, if you hear me say the body piece, this is the piece that I'm talking about. So after I traced around that pattern, I just cut it out and it looks something like this.
So we have the top of our hat and we have the body of our hat.
The next thing I did was I measured the bottom edge of my body pattern, and that for me was about 13.25 inches, and I made a rectangle this same width, so 13.25 inches, and then the length of the rectangle is 3 inches, and that's just the standard length. And it looks something like this, and then I just cut it out. And then once I cut it out, I folded the rectangle in half 3 times. And then when I open the rectangle, you'll see that I have 7 crease lines, and I just made a mark at the top of each of those lines just so that I would know where to stop cutting, because I don't want to cut all the way through. So here again, I just did the slash method, and now it's time for me to spread the rectangles. And I spread each of the rectangles so that they are ½ inch apart. But if you want a more like sun hat with like a really floppy brim, then you can spread out your pieces more than a ½ inch. Then I traced all around the pattern, and then I cut it out after I traced it. And then I titled this pattern piece Bucket Hat Brim. So if you ever hear me refer to the brim, this is the piece that I'm talking about. So these are the 3 pattern pieces, and I just wanted to remind you that they don't include seam allowance. So here I am just taking my fabric. I'm using this skirt that I got from a thrift store, and I'm just tracing the pattern pieces onto the wrong side of the fabric, and just remembering going to add seam allowance to all of the pieces, and I label the pieces with a W on the wrong side, and I also transferred the seam allowance lines to the front and the back of all of the patterns. And I wanted to show you that my brim and my body pieces are made up of two separate pieces, but if you want one standard piece, you can just trace your pattern on folded fabric. So I also cut out a second set of patterns for my lining fabric, and I decided to use a different fabric so you guys could see the difference. On each of my pattern pieces, I marked the halfway point. So the halfway point on the body pattern and the brim pattern. And then I marked the 4 quarter points of the top pattern. So that's why you see 4 marks. And then I cut out a set of pattern pieces on batting fabric. And this batting is going to go in between the lining and the shell. So the shell is the leopard print fabric that's going to be the outside of the hat. So I started by connecting all of the batting pieces to the lining pieces. So I just stitched them along the seam allowance line. This part is optional. I wanted a brim that has lines on it like this image here. So I just stitched a few rows of straight stitches. And if you want to do the same, you can use a chalk and a ruler to just kind of draw out your lines before stitching. But I use this ruler foot, I think that's what it's called, a ruler foot on my sewing machine to just kind of be a guide for each of the lines. So in total I had about 7 lines, and this is what they look like. The next thing I did was I cut some notches into the top part of the pattern just above the seam allowance line, and these triangular notches are just going to help the patterns to be a little bit more flexible so that they line up to each other more easily. So the only area where I didn't put notches was along the bottom of the brim pattern, but every other place has notches. So I'm starting here with the body pattern and the brim pattern, and I'm basically just going to take that brim pattern and fold it on top of the body pattern, lining up the midpoint of both patterns, and then I'm just pinning down the edges or the corner of the 2 patterns. So once the 2 pieces are aligned, the next thing I did was I just did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line down by the bottom where the pins are. And when I finish and I unfold the 2 patterns, it looks something like this. So you can see we have the lower part of our hat. So the next thing we need to do is connect the top part of our hat. So I took my top pattern and I connected one of those 4 notches to the midway point of the body pattern, making sure that the right sides are facing, and then I just pinned it down right where the notches match up. And then I'm literally going to stitch this half of the top pattern to this half of the body pattern. And again, just making sure that the right sides are facing the whole time that I'm stitching. And you just want to take your time and go slow, or at least I took my time and I went slow, and I made sure that the seam allowance lines for the top of the hat was lining up with the body pattern of the hat. And then once I got to the end, it looks something like this. So you can see half of the hat is complete. But now we have to stitch the other half of the body pattern to the other half of the top pattern. Starting where I left off, I'm literally just going to connect this point of the body part to this half of the top pattern. And again, just making sure that the right sides are facing and that the seam allowance lines are lined up. So you see, once I stack it like this, you can see how the hat is starting to close. So I'm just going to pin it down, and then once I pin it down, I will take it to my machine and do a straight stitch along the seam allowance line. So I reached a point where I needed a little more flexibility with my bottom body pattern, so I just cut an extra notch in it so that it could stretch a little bit more to connect with the top pattern piece. And when I finish, it looks something like this. So the full top of the hat is stitched. Now all I had to do is close up that open seam. So I'm just stacking the 2 pieces so that the the side seams are aligned on top of one another, and then I just kind of pinned it down along that edge, and then I'm literally just going to do a straight stitch all along this edge to close the hat. So once I finish the stitch, my hat is complete and it looks something like this. So you can see here that this hat is super thin and flimsy, which is why I'm going to go ahead and add that batting to my inner lining piece. Okay, so I did this part offline, but what I did was I connected all of my batting pieces to my lining pieces, and then I literally followed the same exact steps that I just showed you to construct the full hat. So basically connecting the brim to the body piece and then connecting the top to those two bottom pieces. So this is what my inner lining hat looks like. You can see, like, you see all the raw edges. So I just folded it so that it's wrong side out, and then I took my shell piece and I folded it so that it's right side out, and now I'm going to tuck my shell piece inside of my lining piece, and I'm lining up one of the seams, and I just pinned together the seams, and then I just kind of smoothed the shell piece firmly down into the lining piece to just make sure that everything is evenly aligned. And now I'm just going to do a straight stitch along the brim, but I'm going to leave an area open so that I can flip the shell and the lining inside out. So here's the open area that I left that I didn't stitch, and I'm just going to stick my hand inside of that open area, and I'm literally just going to pull the lining through that opening to the point where I can see my finished hat. And then I'm just going to tuck everything in, and then I'm going to fold the two open areas so that the right sides are facing, and then I'm just going to top stitch that area closed. And then after that, this part's optional, but you can do a nice little edge stitch or top stitch around the area where the body of the hat connects with the brim of the hat. I think that this hat would look really cute with one of these two skirts, so you should check out the tutorial for whichever one you like. In case you're wondering, this is what the hat is looking like.